There's 2 seats. Quick! Grab them. They're in hot demand. Oh, and there's one over there. See? Oh. Quick. This is your moment. There might be more. So thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Hannah. I'm an educator here at VINS, or the Vermont Institute of Natural Science. How many of you have been to VINS before? Yes, look at all those hands. You love it. Thank you for coming back. So you know what a great place this is. You know all the important work that we do here. You know that we focus a lot on education. You may have seen one of our programs. You may have had our birds come to see you at a library or at a school. Maybe you brought in an injured bird to our rehab facility where we treat several hundred injured birds every year. I just saw about 4 nestling phoebes arrive after 5:30, so you know we work after hours to care for all of these birds. And hey, and maybe you work with me in a natural student residence program at a school. So nice to see you, David, from Plainfield, where I've been spending some time. Yeah, so familiar faces all around. Tonight, this is the final one in our series, our lecture series. And I know you're here because we have a wonderful speaker. We have Ben Killam here. He and I, when we started, were just sharing small circle worlds. Your mother worked in my grandfather's doctor's office in Lyme. Small world, I like that. So Ben, however, is known much further than this small world. He's been working and spending time with bears for over 20 years, and he has been talking about bears in travels all over, including internationally. He's been on lots of shows. You could have even heard him on NPR or seen him on The Daily Show or things like that. So we get the real thing. We get Ben live here for this program. So thank you very, very much for coming.
Thanks. Everybody get settled. I started working with black bears about 20 years ago and came at it from rather an unusual angle. I graduated from the University of New Hampshire in 1974 with a bachelor's degree in wildlife and had hoped to go on to do the kind of work I'm doing today. But unfortunately I'm dyslexic and my grade scores and test scores were below par and I failed to get into graduate school. As a result, I went west to a trade school and learned the art of gunsmithing and employed myself as a custom gunsmith over the last 30 years. I've met my wife, Debbie, who's somewhere around here, probably out in the hall. At Colt Firearms, where we both worked in the product engineering department. And in 1982, we moved back to New Hampshire, where I started my own business. And I still had it in my mind that I wanted to do the kind of work that I wanted to do. I had a leg up on this because my father, Lawrence Killam, who was a virologist at the Dartmouth Medical School, studied birds as an avocation. And he wrote a book on the woodpeckers of the eastern United States, as well as a book on crows and ravens. So I grew up in a household with lots of wild animals around. When I was 2 years old, my dad went on sabbatical to Africa and brought a half-grown leopard into the house, much to my mother's chagrin. My younger sister, Phoebe, was 1 at the time, and my next oldest, she helps me with the bears today, and my next oldest brother, Josh, was 4. He woke up one night with a leopard at the end of his bed screaming. But needless to say, we all survived, and we came back from Africa with 2 African hornbills and a Nile crocodile that my dad raised in a basement shower until it was 6 feet long, and the National Zoo came and picked it up. We came to New Hampshire in 1961, and my childhood years were there, and we had all the native wildlife. My dad had licenses to keep everything. It was a time before formal wildlife rehab, so we had foxes and woodchucks and hawks and owls and aviaries with woodpeckers and crows and ravens. And, so I had a good childhood experience with plenty of wild animals around. When my time came along, I was interested in carnivores, and carnivores present a bit of a problem to study because for any of those who have been in the woods and you get a glimpse of a carnivore and he rapidly disappears into the brush. My dad prided himself in studying birds with very simple apparatus. He had a pair of binoculars and a small folding chair. he and my mother would sit in front of woodpecker nests and document courtship and behavior. But for carnivores, I had to come up with a different plan. And based on my childhood experience, I realized I could get an orphan animal, raise it loose in the forest, document its juvenile behavior, and use that as a leg up on understanding adult behavior. I wasn't thinking about black bears. I was thinking about perhaps a coyote or a bobcat or maybe a fisher, the large woodland weasel we had. My sister Phoebe and I became licensed wildlife rehabilitators in order for me to access these animals. She was interested in husbandry and raising them. And after a couple of years, none of those animals came our way. But one day, a conservation officer broke departmental policy. And by breaking departmental policy, I mean that prior to that time, there was no rehabilitation of black bears in either Vermont or New Hampshire. And he brought us an 11-month-old black bear cub that he thought had been hit by an automobile. Well, it turned out, after we had our veterinarians look at it, that it had not been hit by an automobile. It had no infectious disease, but still it was wobbly. It had the shakes and couldn't climb or stay on a branch. And I was interested in finding out what the problem was. But the animal was quickly confiscated from me because of a lack of a permit. But later that spring, I got a call from the director of Fish and Game, and he asked me if I'd take that bear back. And I told him that my intention was to find out what the problem was, and we kept the bear until ultimately it had to be euthanized. And we sent the brain out to the Wildlife Disease Lab in Wyoming and got a diagnosis of lysosomal storage disease, which is like it's a congenital disease caused by inbreeding, like Tay-Sachs disease in humans. And this was the first documented case of lysosomal storage disease in black bears. And since that time, there have been 2 more cases in New Hampshire, 2 in Massachusetts, 1 in Maine, and more recently, 1 out in Wyoming. The likely cause of this illness in the black bear population is the fact that in the 1850s, most of New England was open agricultural land. 85% of it was the forests were gone. They were fragmented, and the bear populations were reduced to island populations. On top of that, there was 125 years of bounty on black bear. So this disease is potentially a problem because for every cub that's born with it, there's 1 cub born without it and 2 cubs that are carriers. And every time carriers mate, the disease pops up its ugly head again. But later that spring, I got a call from Frosty Hammond from Vermont Fish and Wildlife. He's currently your bear biologist. And he had 2 orphan cubs as the result of his study at Stratton Mountain. And he interviewed me and heard about what I was hoping to do and asked me if I'd take the 2 cubs. And I told him that I would, but there was a small problem of a permit. And if he would talk to New Hampshire Fish and Game and they were willing to give me a permit, I'd be happy to take the cubs. Well, the next morning I had a permit in hand. And since that time, we've raised, rehabilitated, and returned to the wild over 105 black bear cubs. 2 years ago, we ended up with 30 black bear cubs. And this was an extraordinary situation. It was following a good food year when there were beech nuts and acorns and apples and berries. And in 2011 and 2012, we had a very early spring. We had 2 weeks of 70 and 80 degree temperature in March. For any of those of you who are sugar makers, you'll remember it well. And that disrupted apple and berry crops throughout the summer. And there was a lot of hungry female bears looking for food for their cubs. Over half of these bears came from their mothers being shot at chicken coops that lacked proper protection. And by proper protection, I mean all it takes is an electric fence with bait on it. And that means you smear peanut butter or kitchen grease on the wire. And bears check out all new smells with their tongue. And once they've been zapped on the tongue, they have very little interest in what's behind that fence. Last year, we had 1 cub And that was from Massachusetts. And then this year, it seems, and following another good food year last year, another beach year, we're already at 14 cubs and counting. There's 5 out there that haven't been able to catch and bring into us. And many of these, again, are coming from chicken coops. So it's a recurring problem. This year we started with the earliest cubs that we've ever had. These started coming in on February 13th. And these were unfortunate situations with logging and the rabbit hunter shot the mother and her den. The cubs that I use in my study are the very young cubs like these that are bottle feeders. These cubs are already accustomed to me. They're going to be close to me regardless of how I handle them. And I realized that these cubs need an education, so I would take them on long walks in the forest up to 9 hours at a time and return them safely to remote enclosures. At the same time, they provided me with an opportunity to learn. I was able to observe their tongues coming out for the very first time and sticking to scent, and lifting it off an object and offering it to a small bump behind their incisors. This bump is called the papilla of the vomeronasal system. Bears, like your dogs at home, cats as well, have 2 olfactory systems, the vomeronasal system and the nasal epithelium. The vomeronasal system goes to the accessory olfactory lobe of the brain, and the nasal epithelium to the olfactory lobe of the brain. The vomeronasal system identifies new scent, and the nasal epithelium learns from the vomeronasal system what those scents are, and are later on able to locate and identify the scent. So I was able to see the cubs in a very exaggerated manner as they perform behaviors associated with olfaction, something that other scientists thought was impossible because scent, after all, is invisible. These same behaviors occur in adult animals, but they're so subtle that it's almost impossible to see what's taking place. Here's some of these bears I followed into adulthood. One of them was a bear named Yoda, who lived until she was 5.5 years old and raised 1 set of cubs. But the main bear that I work with is this bear named Squirty. Squirty's been in both of my books and in all the films that I've done with National Geographic and Discovery. Squirty is now 18 years old and has her 9th set of cubs that she's raised in the wild. Squirty has not only been successful in establishing her own home range, she currently shares her home range with daughters and granddaughters in what I call a matrilinear hierarchy. This is Squirty, and this is her oldest daughter, SQ2, an adult granddaughter, SNLO, a younger daughter, Brooke, another adult granddaughter, 2, and the youngest subadult, SQ2LO, who's the daughter, SQ2. And it's a hierarchy because Squirty on sight will chase all the bears below her in the hierarchy. And it's linear because SQ2 will chase all the bears below her, SNLO will chase all the bears below her, and everybody chases SQ2LO. And the result of this hierarchy is that Squirty in the marginal food year will have access to the highest quality foods in the greater home range. And this ensures that at least one female will be productive even if there's a minimal amount of food. In a good food year, all the females that are capable of having cubs will have cubs. But the second thing that it does is these subadult females, who often stay in their mother's home ranges, won't have the opportunity to produce cubs because of the amount of pressure that they're under. So where if there was an open home range, the female might produce cubs at 3 to 3.5 years old. These females that don't have home ranges might not have cubs until they're 4, 5, or 6 years old. The young males that came into my study area were quickly chased out, as were most subadult males that came around. My study area is on a piece of property that I own in Lyme. It's about 1 mile from the nearest town road. I drive up there in the evening. I provide a small food reward to any bear that shows up while I'm there. And so I'm interested in social interactions, and so far I've documented over 1,000 social interactions, which are the basis of I'm currently a PhD candidate at Drexel University, and they're the basis of my thesis. And what I'll be telling you tonight is from those observations. In this series of photos, Squirty is going after her grandson. I personally watched this little guy get chased more than 30 times, not only by his grandmother, but by his mother and by his aunts and any other bears that were on the target on him. And finally, in September of his second year, he left the greater home range and joined the population of male bears in the Upper Valley. The large males that came into the study area this time of year. It's currently the breeding season for bears. The female bears come into estrus beginning in late May. And these big males, and it's only the top 10 to 15% of the males that do all the mating. These are the 300 plus category pound-wise. But these big males would stay around after the breeding season and take food from the females. Because of their size, they could take food from whoever they wanted. But this was only tolerated so long. And in this series of photos, Squirty, weighing about 185 pounds, is going after a 300-pound male and asking him to leave. I watched another sequence of Squirty's daughter, SQ2, and she weighed only 135 pounds. Doing a very exaggerated and stiff-legged walk, zigzagging slowly in front of a big 350-pound male. He backed off into the bushes and acted like it was no big deal. But in the morning, he was gone and never returned. And this suggests that there's a degree of female choice in mating, because if there wasn't a repercussion, these big males would stay and compete with the females and their cubs in these female home ranges. The big surprise at the clearing was that there was a number of unrelated females that came into the clearing. These were bears that shared an area to the east of Squirty. Squirty and her family controlled an oak ridge, and these bears controlled an area of beach that was about 23,000 acres around Smarts Mountain. These females could come in and share Squirty's surplus, and she showed no aggression towards them whatsoever. And this suggested that there was some degree of reciprocity taking place, and that they had value to her. And if you think about it, that this is the type of behavior that we as humans show. We're more aggressive towards our family members than we are towards strangers. And we're aggressive towards our family members because they're our closest cooperators. They're the ones most important in our life, and we have to communicate with them. Unfortunately, it's not always pretty how we communicate. And we can communicate in all the ways that we do because we can reconcile. But we never go up to a stranger and accost a stranger the same way we might a family member. And the reason is that strangers are also cooperative. And they're valuable to us, and we can't risk alienating a stranger because they might be important to us sometime in the future. So what I've found with these females is that they have some level of reciprocal altruism that parallels human behavior. They have it with all the complexity of a judicial system and justice and punishment, which I'll talk about as we go on. And this is just one of many parallels that I also write about in the book. The male bears are much more difficult to study than female bears, but I suspected that they had some interesting strategy as well. And I found early on that if I put a telemetry collar on a male bear, he simply would disappear over the mountain, and I'd spend all summer long driving around in an automobile or flying in an airplane trying to find out where he went. A male bear's annual home range can be as much as 200 square miles. During the breeding season, they'll be in a relatively small area, but after that, they'll travel to large food sources and the like. And the younger males can be just about anywhere at any time. So I decided to monitor the extra bears in my female home ranges, and to do this I used trail cameras when they came down in price, when the sportsmen started using them and they were affordable. And I would go into an area where there was a lot of bear activity, generally a logging area, a clear cut, where there was a lot of berries, ants, bees, and grubs. And I set up a camera with a gallon bag of corn in front of the camera, and I would replace the bag every time it was finished. And that was generally on a daily basis. And generally, by the end of 2 weeks, I could get pictures of 8 or 10 different male bears. And I did this, I literally took 100,000 pictures before I could make any sense about what was going on. And finally, in 2008, I had the perfect circumstance. I set up in a clear cut that was 16 years old, right at the end of its productivity. The berries were just about gone, and the stumps were pretty much used up. And I got my 8 or 10 different bears. And I set up in the same position in 2009, and the only bear there was the resident female. The males had all moved on. But the big surprise was in 2008, I had an awful lot of pictures of 2 male bears in front of the camera sharing that small amount of corn. And I realized that these bears had developed friendships or coalitions, and that their strategy was to form a loose group of friends and move in and overpower the females in order to access surplus foods in the female home ranges. I knew from my previous experience that a single male, a single subadult coming in, the females would quickly chase out. But by forming groups of friends, they were able to come in and overpower the females. And this, again, is something that only occurs in human populations, the formation of friendships between unrelated individuals for a purpose. And I know these are unrelated because I've done the DNA of all the bears in my study area. We use hair snares and collect hair samples from cubs in every other way we can. And we've had the UNH Genome Lab do the pedigree on all the bears in the study area. So the male bear population is genetically unrelated. All of this is about the access to food. Generally speaking, the females' home ranges are between 5 and 8 square miles. They're cookie-cuttered on the landscape, while their food supply is the highest quality foods in the forest, the nuts, berries, and ants, bees, and grubs. And these foods are generally available in patches and unevenly distributed on the landscape. They're also affected by the weather. So at any given time, one female bear may have a huge surplus of food in her home range, and her immediate neighbor can have nothing. And this is what leads to a system of sharing over time. As I said, the spring of the year is the mating season. The female bears come into estrus late in May until the first week of July. It coincides with the berry season. The male and female spend 3 to 7 days together, and the result of that union is a 2-celled organism called the blastocyst. They're delayed implanters, so that blastocyst doesn't implant into the uterus until late November, early December, and then there's a short gestation period of 50 to 55 days. And the cubs are born in the dead of winter in mid-January, weighing less than a pound. Their eyes are shut, their little ear flaps are down. They continue to develop outside the womb and are unable to walk or climb until they emerge from the den with their mother in early to mid-April. A few years ago, I was fortunate to see the pre-courtship and courtship of the black bear. This is Squirty's oldest daughter, SQ2, and a large male. This is their first meeting. You can see that she's not too happy with him. She's showing quite a lot of aggression towards him, and he's very confident. He's been out Don-Juaning around. He's opening and closing his mouth, expelling moist air from his lungs and picking up her condition of estrus off the airways.
Are they attacking each other?
Finally, he catches up with her and grabs her with his forepaws, and at this time she's almost unable to get away. He bites her behind the neck. Now all of this aggression and the stimulation of the bite behind the neck are necessary. These females are stimulated to ovulate precisely at the time mating takes place, which ensures that conception takes place. This first coupling only lasted a few minutes, and then they broke up, and they spent another 20 minutes going around the clearing with open mouth wrestling. There's a picture section in my book showing this type of behavior. And finally they locked up again, and this time they literally locked up. The male bear has a baculum or penis bone that's hooked like a dog's and locks over the female pelvis. The bears were locked up for more than 45 minutes. There was another adult female in the clearing at the time, and she came walking by about 10 feet away, rubbernecking as the book. And finally they split up and disappeared into the forest. 85% of the black bear's diet is vegetative matter. 10 to 15% of their diet is animal protein. And of that animal protein, 90 to 95% is ants, bees, and grubs. Having said that, they are opportunists. They're not true predators. They don't respond to movement or sound in the woods. But they will, if they have the opportunity, take deer fawns or moose calves in the first week of life. They'll take birds' nests or fledgling birds off a branch if they come across them. And as most animals will, any source of protein. The summer vegetative foods of the black bear grow in moist-rich soils around rivers and streams and wetlands, the lower part of the hills where you might find white ash and red maple growing. There are three main succulents: jewelweed that grows in everybody's yard, three species of wild lettuce, and the most important is jack-in-the-pulpit. And jack-in-the-pulpit is the most important because it has a root or a corm that they eat from the size of a dime to the size of a baseball. And the jack-in-the-pulpit root is their major root crop. And it's more nutritious than either beech nuts or acorns. In years when the nut crop fails, they'll rely heavily on jack-in-the-pulpit to get them through the year. It's the summer food of the black bear that brings people and bears close together, because after all, we settled in the valleys for those same rich soils. So that's where we expect to find the bears. It's not unusual to have a nicely mowed lawn in Vermont or New Hampshire leading up to an old orchard with maybe 3 feet of vegetation. Black bear can be happily out there feeding on jack-in-the-pulpit, and you never know it, unless you went out and saw the stomple trails and the occasional divot of the white roots growing in where the bear dug a jack-in-the-pulpit root. You never know it unless the bear stuck its nose up in the air and smelled black oil sunflower seed. Black oil sunflower seed has 3 times the calories per unit of any of their natural foods. And in the springtime, it can be quite a draw. Bears prioritize their food by the quality of food, the quantity of food, and the amount of risk that it takes to get the food. In my experience, black oil sunflower seed is served up between 5 and 35 pounds at a time. The bear can come into your yard and get a day's pay in about 15 minutes. The average bear needs to put on 30% of its body weight in fat just to survive the winter, to survive hibernation. A female bear that's going to give birth to cubs needs to put on 50% of her body weight in fat to get through the winter and to have milk left over to nurse her cubs in the early spring. So bears are driven by that need to store fat. I say it's very much like humans. Humans and their drive for money. We put our money in the bank to pay for our retirement, to put our kids through school, or to buy a fancy toy. And you wouldn't go home tonight and put $20 bills all around your lawn and expect that nobody would come and pick them up. And that's about the same thing as leaving food attractants around, whether it's bird feeders or garbage nuts. The natural foods that the bears need to reproduce in Vermont and New Hampshire are red oak acorns and beech nuts. Red oak is primarily in the central and southern parts of the state and up the Connecticut River Valley, while the balance of the state is beech. Both states are beech. Bears use a variety of dens. In this picture, I'm climbing out of a den that Yoda used for her maternal den, as well as a den with her yearlings. This is an excavated den. It was dug under an old root mass of a tree that had gone over many years ago. When I crawled into the den and looked up, the ceiling of the den was a matrix of live roots from that live tree growing out of the top of the thing that prevented the soil from collapsing down around her and her cubs over the winter. This bear chose a different strategy. This is what we call an open ground nest. This is unusual in that it's in a hardwood clear cut. These generally are in softwood regeneration, so dense that you could walk by a bear's den 10 feet away and never know it was there. These ground nests can be quite elaborate, like a big robin's nest, maybe 3 feet across and perfectly radiused on the bottom. They're usually up against some kind of structure, either a downed tree or a living tree. This bear chose the summer sun to give birth and take care of her cubs. They also use rock dens. These rock dens make our winter den work difficult. I have a joint project with New Hampshire Fish and Game where we put GPS collars on 10 wild female bears. They're interested in the number of cubs born and the number of cubs that survive as yearlings for their population studies. I'm interested in behavior. A female bear can get into a hole not much bigger than her head. Her body's very supple and she can wiggle down into the cavity. It's not unusual for us to find a den and see the bear down there and be unable to get her out of the den to change her collar. We thought about designing the perfect UNH student that was skinny and strong and flexible and could lower down by his bootstraps. So far that hasn't worked out too well. Here's a yearling bear with its mother in a rock den. And the last type of den that we usually see are tree dens. These are in overgrown trees. When they get to be about 3 feet in diameter, the center of the tree can rot out and collapse, leaving a huge cavity inside. This particular tree was outside of a new residential area in Lyme. It was an old boundary line tree, and early in April I got a call from this woman who said there was a bear in her tree, and sure enough I got there was a bear in her tree, and I informed her that the bear had been in her tree all winter long. With this complex type of social behavior, one would also expect complex communication, and the bears have it. In this picture, Squirty has raised her head and opening and closing her mouth to pick up scent off the airwaves. And one of the things I discovered about the bears was that there's an accessory organ to the vomeronasal system that most other mammals don't have. In fact, no other mammals that I'm aware of have. And this allows the bears to read aromatic compounds, not just large molecules that they can pick up in scent. And the way I discovered it was that there's a sensory nerve that goes down to the roof of the mouth. And the first set of cubs that I raised, I noticed that all the green vegetation they came across, they would hold a leaf in their mouth for a few seconds and release it undamaged. And I wondered what was going on, so I learned all the different types of plants that was going into the cubs' mouths, and I documented what ultimately happened to them. And I learned that the cubs had identified 125 different food items over the course of the first summer and rejected many, many more. And I realized that they could determine whether a plant was edible simply by holding it in their mouth for a few seconds. This is something that the Native Americans credited the bears for. They said that they observed bears to learn which of our native plants could be used for food and pharmaceuticals. And the other thing that I discovered is that there's a bundle of sensory nerves that go up the vomer, which this lays below the nasal septum in the vomer, which is a V-shaped bone, and the V-shaped bone goes up to the base of the brain. There's a bundle of nerves that go up the vomer, underneath the brain, and spread out across the roof of the throat, so that all scent that's coming in from their mouth or their nose passes over these sensory nerves. And so bears, all their long-range communication is done with aromatic scent. And unlike your dogs at home, a bear will react emotionally to the scent that it smells on a wind. So if Squirty is picking up scent like this, and it's her mate during the mating season, she may get a big smile on her face and wait for him to show up at the clearing, even though he may still be 10 or 15 minutes out. If it's a bear she doesn't know or doesn't trust, she may start false charging, swatting the ground, even though, again, he may be 10 or 15 minutes out. Bears have emotional expression. This is honest expression that's coming from their central nervous system. It's like us. We have our facial expressions are our emotional expressions. We wouldn't be able to meet in this room if we weren't comfortable with the emotional state of everybody else in this room. And that's written all over our faces. Right now, everybody in this room has what I call subway face. It's a neutral look on your face, not giving up. And Squirty in this picture, she had just put one of her cubs up a tree. At the weaning time, she has an aggravated look on her face. They have ear expression as well, which is also an emotional expression. She has eyebrow expression, eye expression, and general facial expression. And in this picture, she has a happy face. I often ask people when they're telling me their stories about bears what the bear looked like, and the answer always seems to be it was black. Bears differ in their communication from most animals, except for humans, in that they also have the expression of intention. And our language is an emotional utterance with a mechanical manipulation of our lips, teeth, tongue, and larynx. So we can lie with our words, and we read each other's expressions to determine whether the lie is a lie or the truth. And so that mix is a very important mix for communicating. And I believe this evolved because both bears and humans on a regular basis deal with strangers. And strangers are much more dangerous to communicate with than our family members. So this type of behavior is not seen in group social animals like chimpanzees, yet it's very evident in bears and humans. So bears, when they have an expression of intention, now they chomp their teeth, they huff, they swat, they false charge, they make that guttural sound that the bear did earlier in the video, the ho 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 ho, and a variety of other vocalizations. And the meaning of these sounds and actions is based on the context of the situation at the time. So even though they have a limited means of generating these sounds and actions, they're broadened tremendously by context. So if you were walking on a trail one day and you came across the mother bear whose cubs were already up a tree, and she false charged you, that means she rushes at you and spots the ground and expels a big blast of air. She's simply trying to delay confrontation long enough for communication to take place. Bears read our emotional communications and understand us much better than we understand them. Now, if you were working at a restaurant and you were carrying a pail of food scraps out to the dumpster and a bear false charged you, he simply wants you to drop the pail of food scraps. And I was with Squirty one afternoon on Lambert Ridge and Lime. It was a beautiful sunny day, and this thunderhead came rumbling up the valley. Squirty false charged the thunderhead. And believe it or not, the thunderhead turned and left. I'm going to show you a clip of Squirty false charging, and this is a fairly aggressive false charge. They come in all kinds of intensity, and intensity is an emotional expression. The context of this one is the National Geographic crew was there filming the last film they did on me, and she was tired of them. She wanted them to go home. Now, when that happens to you the first time in the wild, some bodily fluids may run. But just how bears communicate, and it's how they communicate with each other, and it's a bluff. And she's communicating that she wants them to pack their bags and go home. I filmed this with a handheld camera about 10 feet away from her and didn't flinch. I've been false charged lots of times, and it's how they communicate. When Squirty wants me to leave, I'm taking her time. The first thing I see is an eye twitch, and if I don't pay attention to the eye twitch, the second thing I see is a false charge. And early in the spring, when her cubs are really small, if I get too close to her, she'll false charge. So it's just the way they communicate, and when you understand that, it's a good thing. But I'm going to show it to you again in slow motion. And this time, pay attention. This is a deliberate act. She's doing this on purpose. She's not doing it out of emotion or getting carried away. She's simply trying to communicate. It's like us saying, get out of here. And this time, now watch her face and her expression. This time you'll see that she's comfortable, she's alert to what's going on, her eyes are comfortable, and slowly she'll make up her mind, her ears are starting to go back. You'll start to see an expression on her face will go into a long face. She'll deliver her false charge, chomp a few times, and then go back into the relaxed state. She has no intention of doing anything other than asking you to leave. And this one was, again, it's a fairly harsh false charge. I probably should get more of them in here. Some of them, they're a simple bow. Sometimes they just swat a tree. But they do it all the time, and they do it to each other all the time. So it's just how bears communicate. Bears follow each other to find food and follow each other to punish. And as I said before, because they're altruists, they have to have a means of punishing cheaters, just like we do. And bears have a much better judicial system than we do. Wherever they travel, wherever their fur touches any object, they deposit a little bit of scent that can be tracked by another bear up to 48 hours. So there's a transparency about where they go. They can't go anywhere or do anything that another bear doesn't know about. And it's like us having a GPS transmitter in our neck. The NSA could track us all day long and find out what we're doing. Bears share food naturally, so the way they usually find food is to follow another bear to find food. And if each bear has its own set of rules, and if one bear breaks another bear's rules, the bear is able to track the other bear down and exact punishment. This usually takes place in the form of chasing. I've documented lots of chasing at the clearing. It's how the hierarchy is established. The chasing is with the intent to bite, but because of the fact that the subordinates are younger and lighter and can get further out on a limb, it's very rare that the dominant mare catches up with the subordinate bear. So chasing goes on and on and on, and eventually the dominant bear is able to establish herself. An example of punishment, Squirty's adult daughter, 2, came down and had her food reward one night and went up to take a nap, leaving her residuals. SQ2LO, that little subadult, came in and cleaned up the residuals. The subadult females like to push the boundaries with the adults just to find out what those boundaries are. 2 came down and saw that her residuals were gone, picked up the track of SQ2LO, tracked her off into the forest, and exacted punishment. And that's the kind of world that they live in. They're also deliberate markers. I just told you about transparency. Wherever they go, they leave scent, but they also leave scent on purpose. And when they do this, they're using their sebaceous oils in their fur. These are large molecules of long-lasting scent. They don't smell very much. They're not very volatile. In this picture, you might argue that this bear who's ducking under this sapling is not doing that on purpose, that she just happens to be letting that slide across her back to pick up the dorsal, the sebaceous oils in the dorsal area of her back. But this is a different bear, the same sapling. And she's now got the sapling over her back, and she's pulling it over her back like this, making sure she gets every bit of scent on that sapling as possible. The meaning of these marks is also based on context, but it's very difficult for us to do any more than find a mark of a bear in the woods, let alone know what the meaning of it is. But bears know the context and know the meaning of all these marks. Here's SQ2 tracking her mate during the mating season, trying to get back together with him. He's back rubbed on that tree. She's expelling moist air from her lungs to pick up scent. She's using her tongue to pick up scent. Now she's marking over his mark. Now she's tracking his scent on the ground. You can see that her lip and tongue movement. Wherever his feet have touched the ground, she's doing a stiff-legged walk and marking the urine, disrupting the soil under her feet, leaving a symbolic message. Now she's going to walk over a sapling, letting it drag over under her underbelly, and then flips back up like an olfactory. So these guys are very busy when they want to be in the woods.
How tall is she?
She's 5 feet. Adult male bear is my height. Standing height. The most important reason that bears mark is to find their mates during the mating season. A female bear may know who she wants to mate with, but she spent 18 months with her cubs, and now she's got to locate him. The male bears make themselves available. They'll mark on red pine trees or telephone poles or any novel object like a cabin in the woods. They'll back up to the tree, flex their knees, rub that sebaceous oil from their back into the porous bark of the tree. Then they'll rotate their head and bite the tree, leaving some fresh sap. This fresh sap is aromatic, and it goes out and attracts other bears to that mark. Remember, those sebaceous oils don't smell very much, so that's why the bites are in the trees and the telephone poles. And the female bear, again, is out looking for her mate, and when she finally finds him, she'll rub on the tree and let him know that she's nearby. He'll come back and they'll hook up and they'll get out of dodge. There'll be an entourage of subadult males that follow these adult males around. So wherever the female goes, this big guy will follow, and when she stops to eat, he'll set up a 2-acre territory around her, marking multiple trees and leaving those sunken footprints from the stiff-legged walk, warning other bears that she's been taken. Here's a 350-pound male traveling with a female during the mating season and back rubbing on this maple tree. More recently, I've been studying a different kind of bear. Since 2008, I've been consulting with the Chinese about the reintroduction of captively bred pandas into the wild. There's currently 1,600 pandas left in the wild and about 300 in captivity. They've been successful at captive breeding. Last year there were 14 cubs at the Chengdu Panda Base that I work at. I've been over there 5 or 6 times now. The Chinese have been over here once. Debbie and I went last October, and I returned in March. We started the project. It's going to be a long-term project. It'll probably take another 4 or 5 years before we're truly successful at it. But it takes a long time to set up protocols and work with an endangered animal and get all these things done. And it's slow working with another culture. Everybody's involved in everything. So it's not like when I was working with black bears by myself, and I could just do things.
They have to say, what is black bear?
Well, they're very similar in a lot of ways, but they're specialists. They eat primarily bamboo, and they're a lot slower moving. To end up, I have a short visual sequence. I call it Houdini's apple tree gymnastics. So hang on. And finally is dismount. Thank you very much.